Hello, and welcome back to The Canadians. I'm your host, Jared Michael. Here at The Canadians, we attempt to understand Canada's contrarians. We believe contrarians are sometimes the only people holding valuable information the rest of society desperately needs. Today's guest is Nick Osmond-Jones. Nick is a former investigator with the Office of the Ombudsman in British Columbia. Before entering government, he spent a decade working in Alberta's oil and gas industry, eventually returning to school to pursue a career in public service aligned with his values. In this conversation, I wanted to start with his story. What happens when someone inside a government institution begins to feel the norms they once trusted are changing? And what are the professional consequences of pushing back, even quietly, in an environment where dissent is not easily tolerated? Nick describes a gradual shift during his time in government. What began as a strong emphasis on neutrality and a shared understanding that public institutions should remain politically impartial slowly gave way to a more moralized and ideological culture. Training sessions, workshops, and internal expectations began to move in a direction he found increasingly difficult to reconcile with the principles that had drawn him into public service in the first place. After obtaining materials from one such workshop and sharing them with a journalist, a decision that would eventually be traced back to him, Nick found himself under investigation and soon after leaving his position altogether. The result is a story not just about whistleblowing, but about institutional culture, conformity, and the quiet pressures that shape how people behave inside systems they depend on. In the second half of the conversation, we widen the lens. We talk about the challenge of maintaining neutrality in public institutions, the growing tendency to moralize political disagreement, and the difficulty of sustaining open dialogue in a culture where people increasingly sort themselves into opposing camps. Nick has since rebuilt his life outside of government as an arborist and continues to share his thoughts publicly. Here's my conversation with Nick Osmond-Jones. All right, Nick Osmond-Jones, welcome to the Canadians. Real pleasure to have you on the show here.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Oh, yeah. I was hoping maybe in the time we have, we could maybe start with a little bit of your personal story, maybe even starting back of you starting in Alberta and kind of reinventing yourself and ending up as a public servant in BC, and that, as a policy analyst, leading you to be an investigator at the BC Ombudsman office. And maybe that going to your crisis of conscience, we could call it, I guess, leading to, you being a whistleblower and feeling like you had to leak some documents for the public to understand what was happening, and that ultimately leading to your departure. And then maybe we can save the second half-ish of the episode for, I know you've been following the Barry Neufeld case, the school trustee who for many years now has been objecting to gender ideology being taught in the public school system, or has his concerns, and I've been following that case too, and I know you've been analyzing this decision. He was just ordered to pay $750,000 to the BC Teachers Federation. So tying your story and your concerns maybe into that case and discussing that maybe for the back half. And how does that sound to you?
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe if you can get us started and just talk about, I think you said you started as a welder in the oil and gas industry in Alberta, and how did you end up at the BC legislature?
Yeah, so welding was kind of the first sort of real career I got into. I actually started it off in BC. This was like the very early 2000s, but there wasn't so much work and it wasn't paying so well. So I headed out to Alberta, got into it there, did an apprenticeship. So I was working oil and gas stuff, building oil field storage tanks out in the field and in various shops and stuff. But I kind of, I grew up with fairly left-wing sensibilities, some of which I still have. I've always been concerned about sustainability and environment and stuff like that, and wasn't really feeling like I was contributing to that working in the oil and gas industry. I was thinking, I'd like to be sort of working towards a sustainable future and stuff like that. And, we can argue that oil and gas is probably part of that, or maybe has to be part of that. But at the time I was thinking, this isn't... I want to be like out there making a difference in the world and stuff. And how do you do that? So I thought, well, where all these big decisions happen and stuff is in government and policy and things like that. So I ended up going to university. At first I was going for natural resource science, and then it's really politics is kind of what I was interested in. So I've always been a bit of a news junkie, always been interested in politics. So I ended up in Victoria and got a degree in political science in Victoria. And from there, I was able to get into the BC government. First, I got on as a co-op student and then was able to wrangle my way into a full-time position. I started at the very bottom as like a clerk. That was where at the Ministry of Justice, I think. And gradually worked my way up over the course of like 11 years. I spent a lot of time at the Ministry of Health investigating complaints about healthcare. And my last position was at the BC Ombudsperson's office. And during that time, I saw a lot of change in the government, just in the way public service works. Like when I first started, it really felt like the idea that we were impartial servants of the public was something that people were taking quite seriously. Like even my coworkers that I got on with well and would go for coffee with and stuff like that, I could work with them for years and not really know what their politics were. We kind of kept that out of things. And certainly in like office meetings and things like that, you wouldn't bring that up. We're impartial. We may have thoughts about what the policies of the day are and stuff like that, but we're there just to implement things, follow the rules, do the best job we can. And that really started to change. When you'd say like somewhere around the 2015-ish mark, it probably got a lot more marked when you had a lot, it went from Indigenous issues was really one of the leading edges on it, and it went from, okay, what can we do to make sure that we're serving Indigenous people well, to things like land acknowledgements and, bringing colonialism into everything. And, every statement to do with Indigenous issues having to sort of preface it with the fact that, of course, they were oppressed forever and are being oppressed now, and our power structures are terrible and stuff like that. And then you start to see gender ideology move into things as well. Pronouns are starting to appear everywhere and things like that. So it's becoming a much less comfortable place to work, really. And once I got into the ombudsperson's office, I had first thought, this is sort of a place where there's actually going to be some free thought and people can speak their minds and stuff. I'd only been there a couple of weeks, and I was in a presentation with an Indigenous lawyer who was teaching us about a trauma-informed approach to law and things like that. And I ended up making a comment. So it was kind of a typical move for myself, I guess, in front of the entire office. I'd only been there a few weeks, saying that I don't think land acknowledgements are actually valuable. And there's a ton of issues that we could be working on, like, settling land claims and getting drinking water on reserves and stuff like that. And land acknowledgements are really just sort of a distraction from that, a little bit of virtue signaling for people to feel that they did something good about it. And a couple of people private messaged me after that saying, yeah, I agree. And the speaker even was like, yeah, no, that's a legitimate point. And, a lot of First Nations people feel the exact same way. So, okay, this place is maybe it's not so bad.
Did you just really briefly just want to say what the Office of the Ombudsperson does?
Yeah. So it's a really important office, actually. So what they do is they investigate complaints about public bodies, any public body to do with the BC government. So that includes a lot of like crown corporations like ICBC, BC Hydro, and then any of the things you think of from the BC government, complaints about the Ministry of Health, about municipalities, because those are sort of creatures of the provincial government. So jails, so all sorts of stuff like that. So my job was just investigating complaints about all sorts of things. It could be from like somebody who had been denied a permit to cut firewood to somebody that was in jail and didn't like the food that they were getting. So all kinds of different things. And they're not judicial. Like they can't make a ruling and say, this is what needs to happen. But what we're able to do is we've got broad powers of investigation. So like even more than the police, without like a warrant, we can go to a ministry and say, I want all the information to do with this. I want it all now. And they have to give it to us. Without, we don't have to go to a judge or anything like that. So we've got broad powers of investigation, and we've got the power to make recommendations. If we think, there was something that was unfair here, we recommend that you do this, and they have to at least provide an explanation to us. If either they can implement what we said, or they can give us an explanation. And if they don't satisfy us, if we think, they're doing something unfair, they're refusing to do anything about it, then the ombudsperson, he's able to report that to the legislature. He's also able to report it to the media and to the public. So it's an office that they can't compel things to happen, but they, in practical respects, they actually do have a lot of power to address unfairness. So I think it's quite important. It's a quite important office. So yeah, I'd been there for several years, and I started to see not several years, actually. I think altogether I was there 2 years. I left in 2023, I believe it was. And just in that time that I was there, things started changing quite quickly. The pronouns started appearing in everybody's bios. They started ramping up the mandatory sessions to train us on, decolonizing our work and things like that. And I got myself into trouble. I'd been following the gender debate for quite a while and seeing what gender ideology was. So I'd initially, when it came onto my radar, I thought, there's some people that are trans, there's some kids that are trans, it seems like it's a psychological condition. I'm told that, there's a medical consensus about it, and the best thing is to provide this gender affirming care. There's nothing else you can do to make them feel comfortable, and this is the best thing. And I didn't think too much more of it, right? Why wouldn't we just want to do the best thing that we can for these people and kids and stuff? And then you start to see stories that there's actually men who are sex offenders who are saying that they're women and then getting themselves moved into women's prisons and stuff. And then you find out that, some of these trans kids that are, being given drugs that have very severe effects on their bodies actually didn't say they had any problem with their sex up until a few months before they were asking for it. And they're actually kids that are, quite troubled in a lot of other ways. They might have autism, or they're doing self-harm or things like that. And then all of a sudden we're putting them on drugs. So I started to get quite skeptical about it and look into it.
Were you actually Amy Ham and Heather Mason's organization, Cause Bar, has actually been trying to advocate the government to remove those offenders from women's prisons? Were you in the office of the Ombudsman actually seeing those cases at all? Were there women in female facilities complaining to the ombudsperson about this happening?
So when I was at the ombudsperson's office, I took an oath that I wouldn't talk about the specifics of specific complaints.
Fair enough.
I'll say that I wouldn't be surprised if the ombudsperson's office had received complaints regarding that issue in correctional facilities.
Right. All right.
Yeah. So one day we had a lawyer give a presentation to the entire office. Her name's Adrienne Smith. She's a quite prominent lawyer, trans activist. She's argued cases all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada. She's been instrumental in quite a lot of things. She's gotten lots of shout outs from, David Eby and cabinet members and stuff saying that she's instrumental in a lot of these things that they've done. She was quite instrumental in getting funding removed from Vancouver Rape Relief, where, if people don't know, this is a women's shelter in Vancouver. And they ran afoul of trans activists because they wouldn't admit men into this women's shelter. So they were able to get funding removed, and that was a big feather in their cap for people like Adrienne Smith. So she gave a presentation to our whole office. It was several hours long, and it kind of ran through the gamut of the regular talking points that people are probably pretty familiar with, sex isn't binary, it's a spectrum. The idea of male and female is a sort of European social construct that was imposed on Indigenous people when they came to North America. If you don't immediately affirm somebody in the identity that they've told you that they have, then that's against the law, and you have to be doing that. And that's pretty important stuff to be saying to people in the ombudsperson's office who can be expected to investigate complaints about this kind of thing, saying, look, if you don't just take them at their word for what they say, and immediately like help them in any complaint if they're saying like, look, this is a man, but I'm saying I'm a woman and I want these women's services. You have to automatically say yes. So after listening to this BS for a couple of hours, there was question time at the end of it. And I tried to, as politely as I could, broach that, look, what concerns me is that we've got there's a lot of people who disagree with this. These are contentious issues, right? And the real problem is it seems that we're not able to talk about it in a respectful way. So, my question was going to be like, how do we have respectful conversations about these issues? And she didn't even let me finish. She shut me right down. She's like, no, I know what you're doing. I see the transphobic dog whistling that you're doing. This is the kind of same attitude that people had, the excuses they would use to keep black women out of bathrooms back in the 1920s and stuff. And this sort of constitutes, cover for transphobic genocide and wishing that trans people didn't exist. So I was floored. I was kind of like, okay, thank you for that. And again, I had a couple of people reach out to me that said like, wow, I think, she kind of made your point for you there, right?
Yeah.
But I waited for the hammer to drop, and sure enough, the hammer did drop a few weeks later. My boss told me that I needed to talk to her boss's boss. So I had a meeting with his, I think, what is his title? Deputy Ombudsperson. And he said, a few people have complained about this. And at first I didn't even understand what they were complaining about. I didn't really know why the speaker came down on you so hard, but I've been educated now, on the harm that your words cause to people and stuff like that. So I'm going to want you to, I think you agree that you should take some courses on how to be, more respectful and stuff. And I said, no, I don't agree. I should take some courses on being respectful. I think I was totally fine. And, and I think we're kind of really letting this office become political if we can't say things like I said. I thought it was pretty reasonable. He ended up, he had said, no, you should take it. I was like, well, you can order me to. I'm not going to be insubordinate, right? So he ordered me to take a course. I took a course on respectful communication, which the course was actually pretty good. I took it, and my takeaway from it was like, oh, I work in a toxic work environment. We're talking about toxic work environments, or places where legitimate concerns can't be raised and lead to persecution and stuff. It's like, okay, that was actually quite useful. But I thought after that, I've got, I live in Victoria. It's expensive. I've got 4 kids. You know what? I need to just keep my head down here. I'll just do my best to act morally, in my own work and my own cases. And I'll just, in terms of the office, I'll try to just shut up and keep it quiet. So one of the things the deputy ombudsperson had said, I'd said, it's not really fair that you make me listen to this ideological stuff and I'm not allowed to even express any reservations. It's a mandatory session. He said, oh, these sessions aren't mandatory. It's expected that everybody would want to attend, but it's not mandatory. So, okay, great. I won't attend them anymore. And I stopped attending them. But then I had a chance to provide some feedback to the ombudsperson himself. He'd sent out a thing saying, if anyone in the office wants to meet for some one-on-one time and chat, like, let's do that. So I took advantage of that. I sort of told him, look, these are my concerns. You probably saw what happened there. These are my concerns, that we're kind of losing our impartiality and stuff. And I really think we should try to, keep ideology and things like that out of the office. And he played his cards close to the chest. It was like, thanks for your feedback and stuff. So maybe something will come of that. And then a few months after that, there was another session. I didn't go to it, but it was on something on decolonization. And even the people in the office who I would have considered fairly woke after the session, they were like, whoa, that was a little much. That was a little offside. So I couldn't resist. I went on the intranet site and downloaded the slides from the presentation. And they're just absolutely bonkers. Like, it is just like every sort of stereotype you could think of. It was going through what are signs of white supremacy? It's like being on time, being polite, what is European culture? Well, it's based on like dominance and exploitation. How about indigenous culture? Well, it's based on cooperation and getting together. Just all stuff like that you can imagine. I thought like, oh, okay, so I see. My words clearly weren't reserved or accepted very well. And I didn't even think much about it. I was just like, I got to do something about this. So I leaked them to a journalist who put them on Twitter. It sounds like they caused quite a bit of trouble behind the scenes. One of the slides was a thing basically saying that Canada had been the inspiration for the Nazis and the Holocaust and for apartheid in South Africa. And I think some Jewish organizations took like umbrage at that. Thought like, that's crazy. It's like minimizing the Holocaust, all sorts of things. So there was an investigation to figure out, where that came from. I guess the Premier's office was investigating it to figure out where that came from and stuff. And it was several months later, I was at work and my boss came in and was like, you need to come downstairs now. Oh, okay. I came downstairs and there's a couple of HR people sitting there and they gave me an envelope and they're like, you have to leave the office. You're on leave with pay now while we investigate something. And they were investigating me for leaking that document. So 2 weeks after that, I just resigned from the office because I thought, my options, I'd talk to like an employment lawyer and stuff. And I mean, I could have dragged it out. I could have either tried to lie about it, which I didn't want to do. I wasn't ashamed of myself at all. Mm-hmm. So why would I lie and then always have them trying to trip me up? Or I could have, said I was sorry and really tried to beg for my job, which I wasn't sorry either. And I could have dragged it out. I was on leave with pay at the time, but that seems silly to me, sitting there getting paid with tax dollars money for doing nothing. And who knows how long the investigation would happen. I didn't want to work there anyways. So yeah, I just resigned and now I take care of people's trees.
Oh, yeah, that's quite the story. That's and was there how was, just, you don't have to answer this if you don't want, was there a personal fallout that came with that at all? Like just how was that personally? Like it sounds like that was probably a very tough moment to go through in your life. You have 4 kids, you have a wife, you have a friend group, you have coworkers, and you're now the odd man out, the black sheep who's kind of objecting. Was there also a social cost to it?
No, there wasn't. I think one of the reasons I think I was able to kind of weather that storm pretty well is that in government, I always kind of felt like I was undercover, honestly, not like those weren't my people, really. I came from like working in the trades and stuff like that. And it was just such a different work environment that I always felt like, I got to really watch what I say around these people. Right. So I never felt any kind of social fallout from it. And I mean, my wife and my friends were, and especially my wife, just incredibly supportive. Couldn't be more grateful for that. So, like it was scary, financially, and it's a big change. And, kind of, they talk about the government as like the velvet groove, right? Like you get used to working in it. It maybe like it wears on you and stuff, but it's comfortable and it's easy, right? And you're probably never ever going to get laid off. You're going to have a comfortable pension at the end of it, so you really get used to that security, right?
Yeah.
But like eventually, after being out, just like a couple of weeks, probably started to feel just a weight lift off my shoulders, because you realize like how much you're censoring yourself all the time, and how much you're seeing things go on around you that you think are bad, and you're participating in them, even if that participation is just keeping your mouth shut when you feel like you shouldn't be keeping your mouth shut. And it wears on you. It really, really wears on you. Once you start to feel that lift, it's a pretty amazing feeling.
Well, good for you. Yeah. Just to talk about your political journey there, you'd mentioned at the beginning that you were a bit more grazed, left leaning, and you had that kind of the concerns about the environment. And so was it your encounter with all these ideas? Like, do you still find it easy to support left of center candidates, or has your politics changed through all this?
Yeah, I mean, my politics has changed. I still have a lot of the same sort of ecological concerns that I had back in the day, like sustainability and stuff like that. Like I think we have to very seriously look at, how we use the finite resources on the planet and stuff, and steward those things so that it's going to be there for our kids and we have enough, and the term social justice now has become so incredibly loaded, but, I do think that we should be taking care of the most vulnerable people in society and creating the opportunities for everybody to be able to succeed. And that isn't all necessarily left wing. I bet a lot of conservatives would say that they agree with a lot of that stuff too. But there's a lot of probably policies that are quite left that I could still get behind, but in terms of who I'd vote for these days, like it's only the sort of right wing parties that I could really tolerate voting for, just because they're the only ones that still seem based in reality and still seem to support the the kind of fundamental principles of free speech and stuff. Because I think if we don't have free speech, and think that we can listen to different ideas and, the kind of basic tenets of democracy, all the rest of it goes out the window.
It does feel like free speech has always kind of made that argument that it's not just one of many values, but it's kind of that master value that allows us to unlock the rest of the values. And I know you've spoken, you kind of touched on it a bit there too. And I guess that ties into the importance of keeping neutrality in our institutions. And so that's what it really feels like. We're in a spot in Canada now where the vast majority of our institutions are openly biased in one direction. And what do you think the consequences of that are over time?
Well, I mean, I think we're starting to see it. Like, we're seeing it in our schools. We're seeing it in the media. I mean, we've seen it like with the horrible shooting in Tumbler Ridge, right? And seeing that they can't even name the killer correctly. Yeah. They can't even like say who it was. There's like stories from the CBC that you can read on that you would think that it's a woman if you didn't read anything else from it. Or seeing the RCMP stumbling over saying that it was a gun person or something. Like so there's really far-reaching consequences. It's in everything. I mean, our schools are just wild. If you walk through them, like there's progress flags everywhere. Yeah,
I spoke to Professor Eric Kaufman earlier, and he kind of makes this argument that it's like a secular religion, almost the way it's happening. And do you see that at all? Like, it does feel like the way to me, this is my take. I'd be curious to hear what you think, is that the way the neutrality has kind of been pushed out of the Canadian institutions is by essentially moralizing the political project and suggesting that one side no longer has the moral ground to even participate in the process anymore, and one side has the moral high ground. And it feels like it's a moralizing that's doing it, that it's just like there's one side you want to support if you're on the right side of history. And what's your take on that?
Oh, 100%. That's 100% how it's worked, right? It's just completely a moral argument. Like, we're seeing that now in the response to the Neufeld decision. I noticed that the people that are defending the Neufeld decision, they're not defending the actual decision. They're just saying like, look, human rights are good. Hate is bad, right? They won't get into the nitty gritty or the meat and potatoes of like what the decision was actually about, right? Because that's indefensible. But, aren't we all against hate? Like, aren't we all for human rights? Like, things like that, right? So having these things like march through all of our institutions, like it makes it impossible to start doing the right thing a lot of the time, right? Like if we can't say to a man that, no, you can't be in a women's prison. Like we can't even do that. We can't kick men out of women's change rooms. And we're starting to see like perverted men go into women's change rooms because they're able to use that cover, right?
Are you familiar enough with the Barry Neufeld case to kind of give a bit of a nutshell of how it happened and how he started to get into his controversy?
Yeah, I know the broad story of it. I mean, he was a school trustee in the Chilliwack School District. He was there for several years, and he was a vocal opponent of SOGI, which is sexual orientation and gender identity education. So that's like it's a provincial thing. They say that it's not a curriculum, it's just a set of resources, but it's a whole guiding thing about how the education system and schools are supposed to treat gender identity and sexual orientation. And the sexual orientation part of it has become very, very small. So originally the idea of it was, this is an anti-bullying thing. They said that, look, trans kids and gay kids are getting bullied at school and it's really bad and we should do something about it. So it's actually the Liberals, which was the kind of conservative party in BC, that brought it in originally. But it's completely been hijacked by trans activists and, what it's about. Like I went to an education session on it in my school district here in Victoria, and it was just wild. It was talking about like how absolutely wonderful it is to put kids on puberty blockers, how, there's a million different genders and we have to recognize them all, and trans joy is a wonderful thing, just 100%, just pushing it completely, right? So anyway, Barry Neufeld, he's a staunch opponent of that for a very long time. Said lots of things opposing it. And the BC Teachers Federation took him to the Human Rights Tribunal, saying that by opposing SOGI and for other statements that he made, he had caused harm to their, SOGI identifying members. So, anybody that was gay or queer, which I think is a quite different thing than gay in a lot of ways, or trans, they'd all been harmed by his statements. It took about 8 or 9 years for it to make its way through the tribunal and finally get a decision. I haven't read the entire decision. It's something like 163 pages, but the most wild part of it is where they kind of summarized Barry Neufeld's defense, where he said, look, I've been criticizing the idea of gender identity, Gender identity is a belief system that people have that, we all have this innate thing called a gender identity, which may or may not align with our sex. Well, that's a belief system. And I'm criticizing that belief system, and I'm allowed to. And the tribunal said, look, it's not a belief system, because if you are saying that it's just an ideology or it's just a belief system, then you are denying the existence of trans people. And that is an existential threat to their existence. So you can't do that. So you're going to pay for that. And they fined him $750,000. Not fined him. $750,000 will be paid to all the teachers in the district that had their existence threatened by him.
I know the term Orwellian gets thrown around a lot these days, but, even just reading the CBC News article I read on it, and it's just, the line where it says this is not punishment, but it's compensation. You're finding an individual who lives in a trailer park home $750,000, and you're trying to say this isn't punishment, or it's not sending a chilling signal across the entire country, let alone it's pretty striking. And he really is just criticizing gender ideology. I think at the same time he was objecting to SOGI 123. I was going through the documents just as a private citizen, and I was emailing journalists just trying to find someone to cover this story at the time, because I had concerns at the same time that he did, and probably very similar concerns. It's very, very scary that the implications, I guess, of this.
It's huge. It's incredibly far-reaching. So I was just listening to his lawyer, who said that he was very deliberate about he was trying to get the tribunal to say exactly that. That's what he wanted them to say. He never thought they were going to get a fair shake from the tribunal. He wanted them to say, you must believe in gender ideology, and they did. They did exactly that for him.
Wow.
So he said, and now we take it to the courts and we see if the courts make it into law. So in a way, he's gambling the dice massively, because the tribunal is different than a court. So if this now goes to the court and the court says, you can't not believe in gender ideology, then holy smokes, we there's no gray area anymore. We really are a theocracy.
Is this a BC Court of Appeal it's going to, do you know, or BC Supreme Court, or just the tribunal itself?
No, it's to the court, so I imagine to the BC Court of Appeal first.
And so would Barry Neufeld traditionally, would this be a case where he could complain? The BC Human Rights Tribunal is a government organization. Could he traditionally, after being faced with such a fee, could he have complained to the BC Ombudsman's office about his treatment?
I can't remember. It's been so long since I worked there. I don't think we could complain. I don't think you can complain about the
Tribunals.
tribunal. You can you can complain about some other ones. Like I know like the Workers' Compensation Tribunal and stuff like that. So maybe you can, but I'm not sure.
Huh.
Anyways, I wouldn't suggest Barry Neufeld waste his time.
Yeah.
He's not going to get a sympathetic
This is one of those
hearing.
cases where when you explain it to any average Canadian, almost like it's one of those 80-20 cases where people just, do you have any idea why there's this just commitment to this? Usually those 80-20 splits are just easy political layups that, political parties are fighting to lay claim to. But in this case, we have like everything you've named, like the decolonization narratives that have just gone really far, the gender ideology, the anti-racism that's taken it to a new level. Like, these are all kind of running these 80-20 splits. Why such a commitment, do you think, to these ideas? Why not just let them go?
I think mostly fear, like I think there's a real mix of people that don't understand the issues, and people that are just scared. I think that constitutes the majority, really. Like, I think a lot of people are just see like, oh, okay, like, yeah, the trans thing is getting a little bit weird, but, they keep talking about how people are being mean to them and want to genocide them and how much, terrible things are happening to them. So why can't we just be kind? Why are people being mean to trans people, basically? We could put up with just a little bit of the pronouns and stuff like that. It's not so bad. I think a lot of other people, they see what's happening, but who wants to lose their job, right? Like these ideologies are like very entrenched in any sort of white collar, professional sort of situation. So anybody that, even if you're privately employed, you could face all sorts of sanctions and complaints to your regulatory body or whoever it is. I mean, if you work in a university or something like that, like you can't speak out about these issues. You're going to become a pariah immediately. I mean, in government, you can't say these things. And if you want to advance, like I remember one of the first like kind of rebellious acts I guess I took in government was I was organizing a meeting. And I was going to give the introduction to a meeting. And there was a whole bunch of people that were way senior than me there. So it was my chance to, have some face time and stuff and maybe, advance my career a little bit. And I was told, okay, yeah, you'll do the introduction. You'll talk about the issues, who's here and stuff. And you can do the land acknowledgement. And I said, I won't do a land acknowledgement. I'll do the other stuff. But I don't really kind of believe in the underpinnings of that. They're okay. Someone else can introduce the meeting then. So just there, that's, small thing, but that's all those small things add up. Your career isn't going to advance, and those people probably talked about, oh, Nick's, not a team player here, he wouldn't get on board for that. Right. So like little things like that. And eventually I think, there's a psychological thing at play too. If you've said enough land acknowledgements, if you've done enough of those things, you kind of have to start believing it just for your own sanity. Either that or you are going to start losing respect for yourself, because you'll be like, well, I'm kind of a two-faced person, aren't I? You're going to have trouble respecting yourself. So you kind of have to start agreeing with it.
I often think that's the problem. But I do think one of the hardest problems here is the moralizing. Because I think a lot of people just feel like to be a good person today, it's not so much the actions you should be judged by, but it's the set of ideas you believe. It's like, oh, I believe this and this and this, that makes me a good person. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a lot of that going on too, where people don't want to challenge themselves because it's questioning their moral goodness, because they're basing their moral goodness not on their actions, but on their belief system they're attached to, and it feels like one of the hardest ones to crack. Because when I find that some people kind of get through and all of a sudden start wanting to have these conversations, or start learning about, people like yourself who are making good faith criticisms about things. And you find that a lot of these people, and myself included, I was this person when I first came out of my echo chambers. I didn't even have any clue of the issues in Canada anymore. I had been moralizing so much that I had told myself, I literally don't have to listen to those people. And so I ended up not listening for so long that I couldn't even speak to the issues anymore. I just knew the people talking about them are bad people. And that's where I really feel like we just got to, the neutrality you talk about, I think is just essential at getting back the philosophy of neutrality. And not allowing one side to have the moral high ground.
Ironically, like I think that organizations like the CBC should have been the kind of organization that helped us with that. Like if there's anything we need is like a really just balanced source of information that we could have, and we just absolutely don't have that. Or like a federal government that's just sort of a balanced center that's not ideological. That's they're supposed to be the ones sort of adjudicating claims between the different ideologies, not be completely captured by the ideology itself. Like I noticed the other day that the federal government is running ads to convince us that we should all be pansexual allies.
I took a screenshot of that. It was like the day or two after the Tumbler Ridge shooting.
Oh my God.
Yeah, on CBC, pansexual ads started coming up.
Pansexual ads. And it says like, it's so striking because it says like pansexual. It doesn't matter if you don't know what it means. Being a good ally is learning. So like they're saying, wait, it doesn't even matter. You don't even need to know what this means.
Yeah.
Just comply. Right.
Yeah.
It's the good thing. So go along with it. And that's coming from like our impartial institutions. Holy smokes.
Another person I talked to just earlier was a guy named David Cayley, and he was the longtime producer for CBC Ideas, the show. For over 30 years. He made hundreds of radio documentaries for CBC Ideas, and his latest book, a fantastic show, still around. And his latest book is on the CBC, and and he makes he argues that they have abandoned their mission. They should have been holding those conversations you're talking about. He does argue for not defunding the CBC, but he hopes we can reform the CBC to just do exactly what you're saying, become that public forum again. And I asked him straight up, like, as I watched equality being replaced with equity, as I watched the colorblind society value being replaced with anti-racism, sex being replaced with gender, gay being replaced by queer, I looked to the CBC to make sense of all this. And I asked him why they couldn't hold that conversation. He said the exact same thing you said. He said, fear. He said just complete fear, that everybody was just terrified. And so I get that argument for the general public. But what about the true believers? Like, what about the people pushing? Like, why are they so locked in on this? Why can't, even from a strategic point of view, would it not just make more sense to like jettison some of these more reality deranging ideas?
I don't think they can. I think it goes back to what you're saying about it being a religion. I think it's that, I'm an atheist and I always have been, but the idea that religion is left like a God-shaped hole sort of in our psyches or something, like I do think that there's something to that, right? Because I mean, the most faithful adherents to this, they're not coming from faith communities. It's generally people who, if anything, maybe they have some sort of mild spirituality, but for the most part, it's not Christians or Muslims or Hindus or Sikhs or anything like that, right? It's people that are looking for, I think, an overall sort of moral framework to guide their lives, and progressive values give them that moral framework and give them an enemy. That's a thing that John Kay says a lot, right? Is that you can take away people's angels, but if you take away their demons, they'll just fight like hell for that. And I think that's really true, right? Like the boogeyman of like the right wing and stuff like that is very, very strong. That they keep insisting that there's a transgenocide happening, even though like this has been debunked multiple times. Like people aren't going out there and like transphobically murdering people. That's just like maybe it's happened once or twice, but it's really not happening. You can look at the stats. Less trans people are murdered than the average population, and the murders that do happen are happening for the same reasons that other people's are murdered, like a dispute over drugs or a domestic violence thing or something like that. And yet they keep pushing it over and over, even though like that's one of the things that's going to affect the mental health of trans people, telling them that, everybody wants to kill you and hates you. And they're saying, these are people subject to suicide. Yet they keep pushing this thing, even though there's no reality to it.
That's another problem I see with the moralizing. It's that you are if you're taking on that worldview that, one side of the country one is here to help and the other side of the country is selfish, grifters, haters. What a world you're creating. Imagine raising children with that idea that the other half of the country wants nothing but bad things for you. Like, that's just anxiety inducing, where I kind of move through a world where most people want good things for the world. We're struggling to communicate and we're struggling to understand each other. But I move through a world where most people are genuinely good natured and are looking for solutions. Yeah. And that's, I didn't always live in that world. Like before I was in an echo chamber where I genuinely believed the other half of I was a conservative hater. I was a left-wing, activist, and I was deep in an echo chamber. And my personal experience having, I was raised as a old school fundamentalist Christian.
Okay.
And I left that as I didn't reject that right away. I rejected it when I was like 14 years old. And coincidentally, around 15, 16, I went right into like radical left politics. And I was there for a good 2 decades, and I now look back. And I left that echo chamber, and it does feel like leaving. I've left both the religion and left the left-wing echo chamber, and it felt very similar.
Yeah.
It did feel very similar. It felt like, you're committing blasphemy. It's just, I do tend to resonate with that. Describing it as kind of a secular religion kind of resonates with me.
I think it really is. And, there's maybe a bit of that on the right, especially maybe more so on kind of the like mega side of things. It's definitely drifting that way, but I think it's a lot less so. Like I definitely, the times that I was working in Alberta, like off and on, I lived there for close to a decade or so and had a lot of good friends there. And I was always kind of the left-wing guy there, and I'd like, we'd be like drinking and stuff, and I'd be talking about climate change and stuff, and it'd be like, and they'd be like, you're an idiot, but I love you, man. Whereas, here, if I'm in the wrong circles and I talk about like gender ideology and stuff, it's not like you're an idiot and I love you. It's like, you're an idiot and I hate you and I never want to see you again, and I disown you and I won't speak to you anymore. It's a whole different thing. It's a whole different thing.
Yeah, no, it's really, it's true. I remember when I first got out of the echo chamber probably a decade ago, right when Donald Trump won the 2016 election, I got really curious how that happened. And it was, I came across an expression that it was from the conservative circles, and they would say this expression where liberals are good people who believe bad ideas. That's what conservatives believe. Liberals are good people who believe bad ideas, but liberals believe conservatives are transphobe, haters, regressive, and that really resonated with me too. I was like, I do think most of the thinking on the left is done with that moralizing. I just don't have to listen to you. Yeah. And that's a lot of the thinking. But I do find in even that 10 years that's starting to change now. I am seeing more and more on the right, like Justin Trudeau, straight up evil. These doctors committing, child surgeries are evil. Like these woke lefties are evil. And so I'm starting to see that it really resonated with me 10 years ago. I was like, this really, but more and more, like you say, I think that's starting to rise now on the right, where they also too are starting to moralize even more and more. And, we're on the right side of history, the lefties are, where I'm still kind of stubbornly sitting in the center here, I think, on, calling them balls and strikes as they come over the plate here.
That's I think that's the way to do it though. You've got to, at the end of the day, like you just it's so easy to surrender your thinking to the tribe, right? It's such an easy thing to do. Just like, well, you know, and a lot of these things, like, they don't make sense. Like, why does whether or not you believe that climate change is man-made have anything to do with whether you're left wing or right wing? It has nothing to do with it, right? It's like a scientific thing. Or whether or not the COVID vaccine works or not is left or right. It has nothing to do with left or right, right? All of these things, it's like, it's so arbitrary, so much of it. So yeah, I think, like you say, calling balls and strikes just on each issue. Try to look at each issue independently. But I mean, it's hard, right? Once you find a tribe, it's so easy to just kind of feed back that same information into it. And, you know, for people to become more prominent, audience capture is a huge, huge thing.
Mm-hmm. And so how are you feeling about the future?
I don't know. It's all in such flux right now these days, you know, like the Neufeld decision, that could be an absolute game changer. I'm noticing like it looking like more and more people are like actually paying attention to what the issues are. And it's getting harder and harder for, like, here in BC, especially, for them to deflect, just because everyone can see that everything is falling apart, right? Like, you can walk around downtown, like here in Victoria, and just visibly it's getting so much worse, and people can't afford to live here. And, you know, the schools are such a mess. Healthcare. And we've just seen the budget come down, that they're like, well, actually, you know, we're going to cut services and we're going to raise taxes. It's getting really hard to pretend that this is all working. I think it isn't. So that sort of encourages people to look a little bit deeper and say, like, what are the issues? What did Barry Neufeld actually say? And why does he have to pay $750,000, you know, and not just being told, do you support human rights or not? That's starting to not cut it anymore, I think.
Yeah, we have one advantage maybe in this movement that's pushing these ideas into our institutions. Seems like they're just can't help but overreach. Like, you know, like if they just would have give Barry Neufeld a $75,000 fine, it might not have made international news, but like, you know, the whole world is talking about this case, you know, like, and so, they can't seem to help themselves. So hopefully, like, at some point, this ridiculousness just, you know, gets through to the mainstream.
And I think because a lot of the people really pushing it or who have the power are still quite young and idealistic. Hey, like, I think about in the ombudsperson's office, like the senior, like the ombudsperson, and he had 2 deputies, and even the layer below that, I don't think any of them were ideological, but I think they lived in absolute fear of the younger staff that were ideological and that could claim an identity like Indigenous or queer or trans or something like that. They lived in absolute fear of getting called out by them. And I think those, you know, younger ideological staff, they're not going to be as strategic, right? They're seeing things like this is right or this is wrong. And it's great to crush Barry Neufeld with $750,000. Let's set an example. He's evil, right? Saying what he said was evil, believing what he said is evil, and evil people should be destroyed.
Yeah, it's crazy how much some of these, I saw the chair of the woman who runs the BC Human Rights Tribunals pulling over. I didn't fact check this, but it looked like she's making over $300,000 a year. And some of these diversity officers in universities too are just making an absurd amount of money for. Did you ever read The Coddling of the American Mind, the Jonathan Haidt, Greg Lukianoff book?
I think so. Yeah, it's been a while, but I think I did. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just that tactic that they use in the universities where a small minority activist group, like you're mentioning, can, you know, leverage power to take, you know, over the majority of these institutions. They really, in that book, really spells out how they did that in universities, how these small handful of activists managed to, like, take over entire departments, and like just exactly what you described there, where most of these people are not ideological, but they end up having to cower to these younger activists that have really learned how to pull these levers of power in a strategic way. So,
Well, I mean, it's DEI committees basically, right? And they've become like political commissars.
That's well, Well, here as we approach the hour mark here, we might start wrapping up. But yeah, do you have any place? I know you're pretty active. Do you want to share with listeners where they can kind of either hear your story or also keep up to what you're doing in the meantime in the present day?
Yeah, they can follow me on X. It's at Nick_DeCap on X. Besides that, no, I'm just out in the world cutting trees.
Okay, well, I'll put your relevant information in the show notes, and I'll also share the kind of, I know you've written a personal essay you've shared with Colette that, yeah, I'll also put a show note there, if people want to read your story and to hear more about it.
All right. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Okay. Thanks, Nick. You have a good rest of your day.
Cheers. You too.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to support the show, please visit our donations page or subscribe and share with friends. The Canadians. Working class roots, a free speech lens. Canadian Contrarians.